Hello, everyone. Good morning, America, and good evening, Slovenia. My name is Ana Maria, and on behalf of GEA College Faculty of Entrepreneurship, I would like to welcome you all to the third module of the Entrepreneurship in New Reality program webinar that is gonna be devoted to the theme of economic reforms. Firstly, I would like to thank to all our guest panelists here today, the moderator, and of course to you, the participants who are eager to get the new knowledge. So before we start this webinar for today, just a quick introduction for all of you who are maybe joining us here for the first time today and have not been with us in the first two webinars. So Entrepreneurship in New Reality is actually a series of 10 webinars that is featuring 10 actual topics, all addressing this new reality that we are all facing right now. And we have brought together more than 30 guest speakers coming both from the United States and Slovenia to share professional knowledge, ideas, and different perspectives in order to connect the both sides of the ocean. The project ENR, as we call it shortly, was created by GEA College Faculty of Entrepreneurship in cooperation with the United States Embassy here in Slovenia. And of course, we would also like to thank to all our national and international partners to providing this project indeed a reality. GEA College has been a modern business center who has been educating entrepreneurs for more than 30 years now, and we are empowering individuals with entrepreneurship mindset. So today in this third module, I hope that you all who have joined us here today will gain new knowledge and new ideas so that you will be able to grow both as entrepreneurs or as individuals in this new reality. So without further ado, it is my privilege to announce Mrs. J.B. Leedy, the Public Affairs Officer from the Embassy of the United States in Ljubljana, for a short welcoming address. JB, we are happy to see you here.
Thank you so much, Ana Maria. And to Ana Maria, to Rook, to everybody at GEA College, it's great to see you. Our partnership on this project and so many others is just invaluable to the embassy. As we go forward, you know, this is a huge priority for us, entrepreneurship and building business and trade and investment ties between Slovenia and the United States. And we couldn't do it without you, and particularly your audience of young, enthusiastic entrepreneurs. Because, you know, in this era, while we're all sitting here in lockdown, thinking of how we can build back better, and knowing that it's going to have to be together and we're going to have to work together to do it. This conversation about how we create a transatlantic environment that really supports entrepreneurs and SMEs, those who are going to be the pillars of this recovery, I think is really, really, really well timed and essential. And so I want to thank all of our panelists as well. I'm thrilled to have Professor Raj Bhala from University of Kansas, Jayhawks as one of our speakers from the US. And thanks to Sonja Šmuc with the Chamber. You guys are always great partners as well. We've had a really, really good relationship over the years. To Mr. Veselinovič from GEA as well. And then, of course, to our moderator, Bojan Ivanc, who is actually a recent alumni of an embassy program as well. So we're going to keep building these relationships and look forward to the talk this morning.
Thank you so much, JB. This was such an honor and privilege to hear how everything is actually connected. And it's really a privilege indeed that we can all work together and connect to provide good content and valuable knowledge and new ideas for entrepreneurs. So now, of course, let's move to the panel. Let me welcome our moderator for today, Mr. Bojan Ivanc, who will lead today's panel. Bojan is the chief economist at Analytics Department of Chamber of Commerce and Industry here in Slovenia, and his roles are forecasts on economic trends in Slovenia, and of course he takes part with the most important estimates on major legislation changes that Chamber proposes. So Bojan, welcome. Thank you for moderating this panel. And of course, this virtual floor is yours.
Good evening, good morning. Thank you very much to be part of this event with this amazing title about how to provide a flexible market with reforms. So the goal of this webinar is to define the necessary changes to kickstart the economy's growth, so the post-pandemic growth. So our focus is more not about the current measures the governments are taking, but we'll discuss more about the future steps. So the day after the pandemic, we will look at the possibility of reforms. So in light of this pandemic push, and also we'll discuss whether we'll see a significant effects on the value chains, or there's only a lot of discussion on that and nothing will be changed. So it will be like the day as usual, or we'll definitely see some changes. So this is the discussion. And the third, of course, goal is to look across the lens of different countries. So I already had an initial discussion with all great three guests on the different reforms. And of course, across the globe, there are similarities, but there are of course differences. And with my guests, I'll try to, let's say, take a focus from the US view. I will look from the EU view as well as from the Slovenia view. So we'll talk about the policy priorities. So let me introduce the three guests. The first, Ms. Sonja Šmuc. She is a general manager of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry of Slovenia. So basically she comes from the same institution as myself. So her focus are, let's say, different aspects of the competitiveness of Slovenian economy, especially leadership, labor market, tax system, business ethics, and women leadership. This is followed by our guest from the US, Mr. Raj Bhala, a professor at University of Kansas School of Law, and also a senior advisor at Dentons, the world's largest firm, which is focusing on international and comparative legal matters. And our third guest is Mr. Draško Veselinovič. He's the CEO of Slovenian Business and Research Association, or SBRA, which is a liaison office of Slovenian business, research, and municipalities and Brussels. And Professor Veselinovič is also a professor at GEA College. He also published several scientific financial books, over a lot of academic professional articles, and very interesting also 3 books on aphorism. So why am I talking with you about aphorism? Well, I just received his book when I was working at one of the banks in the past for my birthday from my friends, and it was just a book of him about aphorisms. So I think the name of the book was "If You Don't Have the Money, Then You Should Buy It." So just for your information, this book was really great. So this is just let's say couple of starting words for our discussion. But first, I would like to give word to Raj. Raj, thank you very much for being our guests. So I would like to focus or to share your views on the structural market changes. Do you think it's the timing right? What kind of market changes should the world on the multilateral level take, or on the US level? And of course, who's also guiding the market reforms? Are these the IMF or OECD, or which are, let's say, now the organizations, and what is their, let's say, current recommendation on that? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and good evening to all of you. Let me thank, of course, GEA College, the Chamber of Commerce, and the U.S. Embassy. It's a great privilege for me to get to be with you, and I hope I can share some thoughts that will be helpful on the topics that we've laid out. Let me mention that, of course, from a legal perspective, you may be thinking, well, we're going to get a talk by a lawyer who's going to tell us all the do's and don'ts and focus especially on what not to do. And that's a heavy negative talk that is a constraint on entrepreneurship. And that you might also get a defense from a lawyer about rules like, in order to set up a business, you have to have a physical storefront. Well, I want to immediately say, no, that's not the talk that I'm planning to give. In the next few minutes, quite the contrary, I would like to stress that the legal framework for economic reforms, particularly with respect to trade, international trade, has plenty of opportunities for us to take advantage. And I'm going to go through 10 points, briefly, of course, and suggest what those opportunities are, as well as identify the risks. One of the themes you'll see is that there's no one model, there's no one right way. Sometimes the WTO or the IMF might have the right standards. Sometimes the US might, sometimes Slovenia might, sometimes India might. So I'll draw from lots of experiences in lots of countries. And I think that leads to a second theme that cuts across the 10 points, and that is we, or let me say in this case, you in Slovenia, you're not alone. The difficulties, the challenges of reforming the market to make it more entrepreneur friendly is something that lots of countries are dealing with. There's lots of opportunity to learn from other examples. So my first point number one, private sector, public sector cooperation is really essential. In the example of India, where Prime Minister Modi tried to demonetize the economy or tried a COVID lockdown, they failed because they were so non-transparent and non-consultative. In contrast, in other countries where such moves have been made, they've been much more successful. In the United States, for example, before any trade agreement is launched, negotiations for a trade agreement, there always are advisory committees set up on virtually every topic: labor, the environment, industry, agriculture, intellectual property. And these consist of representatives from localities and states around the country that meet with the federal government officials. And the question is, or at least ought to be, from the government side, tell us your concerns. Tell us what you need from us in terms of a negotiating outcome. I've seen that also in India with the Director General of Foreign Trade meeting with over 100 representatives representing 10,000 businesses in Mumbai, for example, saying, how can we help you on anti-dumping reform rules? So I would stress the importance of public sector, private sector cooperation and the open-mindedness of the government officials. Second, subsidies. Subsidies are sometimes said to be a dirty word, and in some cases they are illegal, but not in all cases. The World Trade Organization rules do permit subsidies on agriculture that are considered green box, that support farmers and agribusinesses in non-trade distorting ways, including straight income support. And likewise, when it comes to industrial subsidies, as long as the subsidies are not specific to an industry, they're permissible. So, and they're not supporting, they're not boosting exports or causing import substitution. They're permissible. So, for example, the Slovenian government could say, we are going to subsidize all entrepreneurs, regardless of goods or services, so it's not specific, with respect to helping them meet environmental standards for the Paris Agreement, or on research and development up to a commercial prototype. That would be permissible under the WTO rules. Third point, services. A lot of times we think of goods in the trade world, but of course, as many of you entrepreneurs know, your value added is in services. And in the WTO agreements and in every free trade agreement, including that between the European Union and other countries like Japan, there are rules that liberalize services. And I would encourage entrepreneurs to push for continued liberalization in the services sector. Now, Services are traded in 4 ways or 4 modes. Cross-border, using electronic means like the internet. They're also traded by virtue of consumption abroad, where the service consumer goes to the service supplier's country, like when you go and visit the United States and you consume tourism services, hotel services. There also services are traded by foreign direct investment, where the service supplier goes to Slovenia and sets up an operation. And finally, they're traded by virtue of temporary migration of professionals. All 4 modes are very relevant, depending on your business, to be liberalized. And here's where you have to really look in services schedules and tell your government, that's point 1, we need better market access, say, for example, to the Japanese market on mode 1 or mode 3 or whatever it is. 4th point, on finance. Many of us are financial entrepreneurs, and I would stress the importance of looking at socially just or socially responsible, or ESG financing, environment, social, and governance funds. There's a tremendous amount of interest in those funds. And that means even at the cost sometimes of the highest performing funds, many more and more investors seem to be saying, I prefer an ESG fund with a little bit less return than a non-ESG fund. And probably the best examples of those are sovereign wealth funds. We're seeing, of course, in Norway, divest from hydrocarbons. My 5th point is on government procurement. 20% of world GDP is government procurement. Governments buying goods or services. In fact, the single largest consumer in the world is the United States government. So on the one hand, your opportunity is sell to the government, get registered across the world. Whichever government is open to foreign government procurement, you want to be there able to bid for contracts. On the other hand, watch out for protectionist or potentially protectionist legislation. We've seen that in India, and we're seeing it potentially in the United States, where governments say, well, in order for us to buy from you in Slovenia, you must have a certain percentage of your good have US content. Now, those are understandable reasons, especially with the recession we're all in. And that means you have to navigate those rules of origin for government procurement. My 6th point is on intellectual property. So many of you have the most amazing ideas that are patentable, subject to trademarks, or copyrightable. And the simple legal advice is do it. Get the intellectual property protection, because you don't want your idea pirated. And that has been a source of dispute, and I'll finish with that in a few minutes, between the United States and China. 7th point is on standards. Who has the best standards? I mean, we like to say the EU does, and that's often the case, though I can give you examples, maybe hormone-treated beef, where not necessarily. Those standards are actually protectionist. The point is to look at each merchandise, each product category, and look at the sanitary and phytosanitary measures and the technical barriers to trade that affect them, and then tabulate with your key markets. If your key market is the EU, that's the standard you want to meet. If your emerging market is the United States or Japan or Indonesia, then and let's pick Indonesia or Malaysia, then you may want to meet the halal standards to get into the Islamic certified market for, say, your meat products. So it really isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. It's which are the standards that are most appropriate for what your market you're going into. The 8th point I would say is push for lower applied tariff rates. This is old-fashioned stuff, that tariffs are still barriers to trade, especially in some of your biggest emerging markets. Some of the those markets, again, India being an example, the US in some cases have high tariffs. And in fact, they're going up. Pay attention to budgets that are coming out, as just did from New Delhi. As are they raising tariffs? And you always want to push for lower applied tariffs. The ninth point, which I sort of suggested already, is ask yourselves, which are your most important emerging markets over the next 5 or 10 years? You can see, for example, post-Brexit, the British government has said they want to have free trade agreements with 80% of their exports. So likewise, as a strategic vision, for Slovenian exports or for your own company, which are the key markets that are growing for you? And the last point, the 10th point, China. This is a strategic threat, the Chinese Communist Party. I encourage you to read the reports of the US Trade Representative and the White House that came out in 2018. They are very well researched and well footnoted, and they enjoy bipartisan support. We will see a change in style with the new administration on how to deal with China. And we will see, more cautious, more deliberate approach. But we are not going to see a change in substance. And so when you think about your strategic position and your entrepreneurial goals, you are going to have to think about how does China matter? Is it, for example, an intellectual property threat, a cyber attack threat? Is it illegal subsidies? Is it state-owned enterprise competition? All of those are going to be relevant in your plans going forward. So I hope those are helpful points, and I look forward, of course, to learning from my fellow panelists and from all of your questions in a few minutes. Thank you.
Raj, thank you very much for taking time and for having, let's say, a great overview. But I would like now to give the word to Sonja. Sonja, what's your view? When is it the right time for Slovenia to take those, let's say, some structural market changes? Is this in recession or expansion? So if I'm correct, we were always the best with reforms in recession, when there was, let's say, when it was very difficult to get the new government loans. But now we are in totally different situation. We just issued a 60-year bond with the yield to maturity below 1%. What do you think, Sonja? What will give us the push to, let's say, to try to focus on some reforms?
Well, we from the business are never happy with the push for the reforms. We always have lots of ideas what should be reformed. But if let's first say that the structural market changes come in two ways. One has something to do with policies that governments prepare, and the other, it has nothing to do with governments, and it's just the structural market change that happens because you are in a recession, because you are in an expansion. So because there is technical progress, because there is a switch in something else. So I think that we always have these structural changes in markets that follow the development of certain industries. That's why we see companies booming, and then next year not even knowing about them anymore. So it's a very fluctual process. But if we talk about policies, so when is the time to do the policies that have influence on market changes, and whether to do them in recession or expansion? It depends on which policies we talk about. Some policies it's easier to do in recession, some is easier to do in expansion, and vice versa. Some are impossible to do in recession, even though it would be a smart thing, and the others would be very strange to do them in expansion. So it so depends on where in time you are. But maybe I'd like to bring up a little bit of memory, go to the memory lane. like a decade ago, we were in a sort of not the same situation, but we were on a global crisis. There was a crisis of global dimensions. It was a different type of crisis. It was completely financial crisis. And the go-to method was of how to be more restrictive, how to take really care of the money because it's a financial crisis. And we learned from that approach has huge negative consequences. And now we are in a pandemic situation, and we are going, at least when I can talk about Slovenia and Europe, we are going a completely different way. So away from restrictions to very generous policies. We're having the crisis of that's much deeper than it was 10 years ago, and yet there are not that many that feel the negative effects of it yet. We've seen a decline in bankruptcies in personal and in companies, and it's not only Slovenian, it's European situation. I'm not so sure how it's in states, and that's very unusual. So either we are just kicking the can down the street and it will stop somewhere, and then we'll deal with a lot of headache. But then again, as if we can prolong the time when we will have to deal with the consequences, we can use that time that as many as possible people stay well, as many as companies stay and businesses stay afloat, and so that after the crisis is gone, that they just don't go bankrupt because they just happen to be caught in this moment. But if we help them to come to the other side, they will be still alive and being able to help in solving the problems that we will learn this sort of dealing with the problem causes. I'm sure that as much as we learned 10 years or 12 years ago, we will just as much learn of how to and how not to deal with the crisis as we're dealing now. But now we're in the midst of it, and I think that for us all, it feels much better, much more negative than it did a decade ago.
Great, thank you for your feedback. By the way, in addition, you just saw a poll in front of you, which you can answer. So we'll leave about 2-3 minutes more, so you can look at the policy priority areas for your local governments. So we would like to ask for a view of all the audience. But before we will look at the results, I think it's time that Draško gives his perspective on the EU. So Draško, from the view of Brussels, how do you think the EU, let's say, will push for the reforms? So according to my view, so the EU, let's say, kind of try to make a common fiscal push, but let's say, how likely is it that the EU, let's say, will again look at its policy tools and ask its members for the reforms? How likely is it according to your view? Draško, do we have you on board?
Yes, I think that.
Yeah, sorry, I just forgot to unmute myself.
Yes, okay.
A very interesting question, really. I mean, we are, the whole world is talking about how European Union should do some fiscal policy together and have some really fiscal instruments on board there. However, it is quite unlikely, although, you know, just during this crisis, actually, European Union issued some bonds just recently for, you know, supporting the workforce, you know, subsidies and so on. So actually, some things are happening, something is moving. However, I'm not optimistic regarding, you know, very unique and common or single, let's say, fiscal policy for some years, I'm quite sure. Nevertheless, I mean, on the other hand, we have this European budget, which European Union had very severe problems how to get it through the European Parliament, and first of all to get it through the leaders of all the countries. And for our US friends, it's actually very probably interesting how to unify 27 countries with 27 different cultures, languages, etc., etc. So for some time it looked quite pessimistic, but even myself, I was already quite pessimistic getting all the news, what was happening in Brussels and so on. But finally, European Union managed to get through the budget, which is the record one. Actually, it's in 2018 prices, it's 1,800 billion euros for 7 years, of course, period 21-27, which is in current prices 2,000 and something billion. And of course, it's in two parts, unlikely from the previous years. It's one normal part, so to say, where we have this, let's say, normal items, I mean, normal European Union items, so to say. I can talk about them later on, maybe more about it. And then we have this so-called next generation financial instrument, which added in current prices 800 billions. You know, so we actually almost doubled the EU budget for 7 years period compared to previous budgets, and that's quite something. And part of this will be also taken on the market. So European Union, European Commission will appear on the market as issuer of the bonds, in fact, which is a revolution, I would say, you know, really. So some things are moving, and maybe compared to the discussion we had before, you know, it's really interesting. I mean, if you compare two crises, you all talked about it a little bit, but let me add this. I mean, remember first crisis we had, we started in financial sector, and then it really boosted in economic, in the whole economy, and even, you know, the whole countries, I mean, globally, of course. We had United States reacting very fast, you know, typical according to Taylor's rule, you know, so there's some depression, lowering interest rates immediately, you know, and you went even below zero. Remember, in Fed rate, even went below zero, in minus, which is quite rare, right? And of course, you got out of the crisis relatively quickly, you know. When Europe, you know, having problems with euro, you know, not having all those mechanisms saving euros, you know, which are in place now, but they were not in place then. Greek crisis, then some other crisis, PIGS countries, remember, and so on. So we needed quite some years to really pump money into circulation. Then finally, in some years, let's say, European Central Bank succeeded to pump quite some money, you know, buying different bonds and some other instruments on the market, on open market policy system, according to that, and pump money in the circulation. So, but now with the Corona crisis, we have the vice versa situation. US reacted quite slowly under the Trump's presidency, and Europe is quite fast, I mean, surprisingly. Okay, this vaccines stuff is now still on the way, but otherwise, regarding these programs and budget approved in European Parliament, it's not so easy, you know, 27 countries, 28 just before New Year, you know, it's not easy, I mean, and it went through. So this is really, this is quite optimistic for me. And you have to bear in mind that European Union is not a legal entity at all. So European Union is just kind of agreement. Okay, it has bank accounts, so governments can you know, put some money there on this banking account in order to collect European Union budget, which then finances in 3 different ways national priorities, you know, and according, of course, to European priorities. So we have quite complex system, and of course, European Union is complex system, but you know, I'm quite optimistic. Being in Brussels, having confirmation, seeing all you know, problems from inside, really, you know. We did some quite important steps forward recently during this crisis, and the situation in some periods of time was very pessimistic, you know. Some countries were pushing for some decisions which were not, I would say, in favor of common European policy, and so on and so on. If we talk about what is this now European budget, what it is, what is used for, I mean, obviously it's still agriculture, and it's within the item which is called natural resources and environment, but the bulk of it is really agriculture is still number 1, which can discuss about that. Number 2 is cohesion, resilience, and values. So cohesion, again, this is the money that national countries get it back and disperse it via public tenders within the country, you know. And then third item is single market innovation and digital. So European, when you talk about this, you know, changes, right? We are talking about changes also now, you know, restructuring, okay? So European Union is according to the instruments having there, not being legal entities, as I said, having very complex situations, so many countries, so many voices and so on, is trying quite hard to do something to push for innovations, you know, because now we are lagging behind US, not to mention China and so on. So there is a push for that. And I see it positively, although more could be done. But then again, I see it as top-down approach, especially now with Britain being out. So we'll probably see more this top-down approach. Of course, national countries still can have bottom-up. And of course, we can discuss if something comes from top, maybe they hear the voices from the down, from the bottom, you know. But, you know, so this is a proper situation of European Union, quite complex, but in this case, in pandemic crisis, reacted, I would say, faster than US.
Draško, thank you very much. Maybe just my personal observation. I was just looking at the IMF tables on the GDP growth rate in the last year and in the current. So I was quite disappointed still to see that the US, as you're stating, of course, helped the economy a bit later, and let's say with other types of supports, but still the GDP fell just by 3.5% according to IMF estimates, whereas in the euro area it fell by more than 7%. You know, so it is true. Yeah, at the EU level we were, of course, let's say we struck the deal faster and sooner than we expected. But the problematic thing is still structured one. One is, of course, that the federal budget represents, if I'm correct, about 20% of US GDP. In case of Europe, the EU common budget usually represents about less than 1% of GDP of its members. So this is like the basic.
It's 1 and something now. It's 1 and something now after all these negotiations. Yeah, but you are right. I mean, it's Europe is still struggling, you know, it's a very complex system. I mean, we would have to do something more to have more efficient system. And look, if you within European Union, if you look just Euro countries, it's even a little bit worse data. You know, it's even a little bit worse. So somebody would say Euro is not a good thing because Eurozone countries have worse results, economic results than, let's say, you know, countries in European Union without Euro. So it's even that, you know, but I don't know. I'm somehow optimist about this. You know, I'm Euro fan, so to say. I mean, I believe in this as a single currency. I think it's a great achievement. It's very unique in history of money. You know, and it's getting better and better. And the European Banking Union would be even improve it. You know, but we are still not there.
Great. Thank you, Draško. If we take a look at the poll results, so the number one is to reduce the bureaucratic burden. This is according to the audience, the priority thing. So I can only tell you, for example, from my perspective at the chamber, this is also from the side of the companies number one problem, and it's heavily stated. You know, so this is kind of, let's say, quite a burdensome piece of legislation. I was looking at, let's say, different agendas of different governments in the past in Slovenia and also in the EU, and there was always a lot of talk on reducing the red tape. You know, what's your perspective? You know, your major is legal. What's your perspective on how this can be changed at the level of EU? Or, you know, how can US provide useful advice to the EU on that field?
You mean with any specific, with respect to any specific sector, or generally on
bureaucracy general, right?
My question is more generally, Raj. Yes, my question is more general one. Yeah.
Well, it's the normal way that the US and the EU will engage on standards and technical measures, if I understand your question correctly, is going to be through product by product trade negotiations to develop a mutual recognition agreement, or MRA. And the basic goal in a perfect world is that each side recognizes the sanitary and phytosanitary standards, SPS, and the technical barriers to trade, TBT, of the other with respect to the product in question. And therefore, there's no need to create two different supply chains, one for the US market and one for the EU market, because the standards are recognized as equivalent. There's also no need for duplicative laboratory testing, because each side recognizes the laboratory testing quality of the other. Now, the negotiations tend to resonate between the following kind of concerns. On the one hand, both the US and the EU want to protect their consuming public, whether it's from mad cow disease or it's from toasters that blow up and cause a fire in your apartment. On the other hand, some of the standards that are proposed may be outright protectionist, that is designed to protect a domestic producer of the like product from foreign competition. And so the dynamic in the negotiating room bilaterally is, hey, be reasonable. Are you really protecting the public, or are you protecting domestic producers? And again, it's a product by product discussion.
That's why these negotiations are taking so much time, right? For years and years sometimes.
Absolutely. You can spend, exactly as you said, years and years. For example, in the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, I remember on the annex concerning medical equipment, US has a comparative advantage in surgical and medical equipment, kidney dialysis machines or surgical instruments, precision instruments for eye surgery. And of course, the US wants to get those instruments and equipment in every TPP country. And those negotiations just took forever. And when you look at the annex, it's practically longer than the TBT chapter itself. But it also is a very good example of a point we discussed earlier, and that is public-private partnership, because the producers in the US of those precision instruments went to the US trade representative and said, we want access into Vietnam and Japan and Malaysia, et cetera. So this is what we're going to need in a side agreement or an annex to the free trade agreement.
Maybe just Raj, one more thing to ask you. So we have a question from the audience on a very interesting topic. So if you could discuss, let's say, the crisis in relation to different sectors, about what you say about post-COVID, when vaccination will take place, which sectors are going, let's say, to let's say, have, let's say, a faster growth than the others. So which sectors would need, let's say, more government support than the others? What's your perspective from the US?
Well, that's a great question, and I want to confess my limitations in economic forecasting. Let me offer a couple of perspectives on. One is, I think that forever the COVID pandemic has caused in the US, and I think in most other countries too, an appreciation that public health policy is trade policy, is national security policy. Public health is a matter of national security, and a country cannot rely entirely on foreign supply chains for all of its personal protective equipment and its vaccines. We're seeing vaccine nationalism, et cetera. So even once this horrific pandemic is over, I think you're going to see governments planning for further pandemic shutdowns and making sure they've got a local supply chain or at least a regional supply chain. Now, you're very fortunate in Slovenia being an EU member because you've got 26 other partners to count on. We are in the United States with Canada and Mexico. So I think that's one thing. I don't think we're going to return to a world where economic interdependence, where we can rely, say, for example, on China or India for medicines or PPE equipment. We're not going to return to that world. Now, as to which sectors are going to do well, well, most obviously, any sectors that provide goods and services for the healthcare industry, meaning hospitals, nursing homes, and I hate to say it, but funeral homes. Also, any providers of goods and services for geriatric purposes, for our elder population, they're going to do very well. And the EU is an aging population. You know, Korea is, Japan is. The US, I don't know the exact statistics, but would be but for immigration. So healthcare and elder care services are going to do well. Likewise, what we're doing now, the delivery of substantive content via Zoom or via the internet, and more generally, e-commerce products are going to do well. So those are sectors that I think will grow. Conversely, sectors that involve local interaction, and restaurants, bars, retail stores, those are going to need government support. We've seen tremendous declines in employment and output in retailing, restaurants, bars, and associated with that hotels also. And they're probably going to need government support. In terms of the transportation sector, at least for the foreseeable future, the airline industry is probably going to need some kind of support. If we are to judge from statements from United Airlines and Delta Airlines, etc.
Thank you very much. Maybe now just to look at to make a point about the supply changes. Draško, maybe from the perspective of the EU, what do you think? Is it likely that there will be significant value chain changes in the value chains across manufacturing in Europe? Do you think, let's say, the part of the manufacturing will, let's say, come from Asia to Europe, so it would be kind of reshoring of manufacturing? Do you think Slovenia, or let's say Eastern or Central Europe, has a chance? So my point to make is just, do you think that the trends which, let's say, helped to grow our economy, as also the economies of Central Eastern European countries, are going to be there also in the next period? So I'm just, let's say, looking at the numbers of the growth in industrial production in Poland, in Hungary, and I really see positive numbers. So Draško, do you think this is like a more lasting trend where we could be beneficiaries in our region because of the reshoring of the value chains?
Yeah, very good point and very good question. I agree. Yes, I think globalization will be much slower after the crisis. I think we will even face some deglobalization trends, and I think some manufacturing, some new manufacturing might, instead of going to Asia or so on, happen in, let's say, maybe East Europe or in national countries. In fact, not so much export of, let's say, manufacturing will be in future. That's my kind of opinion, and. Maybe just regarding Raj, what you discussed before, I would add one promising sector in future, also logistics, because of all what's happening and so on. I think that this could be an interesting sector for the future. And of course, the digitalization, you mentioned it, and this is quite important, one even happening already. But regarding manufacturing, I think some changes will be there because they are happening already. People are much more cautious, though decision makers, making new investments and so on. They tend to more look at their local markets, or let's say maybe region that they know very well, you know, and some manufacturing might even return from, let's say, you know, Far East and so on, where they were, you know, heading before in order to get cheaper workforce. But then you have other problems then coming up later during this crisis.
Sonja, what do you think, let's say, in terms of the policy mix that our chamber is proposing, and based on what we heard from Draško and Raj, what do you think Slovenia should offer to foreign investors? So just imagine, let's say, a company which already had part of production in Asia, and of course is now looking to move part of its production to Central European countries. Of course, they look at Poland, they see a big global market, they see the vicinity of Germany. How could Slovenia differentiate itself, let's say, when this investor comes, let's say, to one of the big four offices and asks, why should I choose Slovenia? What could Slovenia offer that Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, or Slovakia do not? What's your view, Sonja?
Well, when you asked me that question, a thought of Arturo Bris, the director of IMD competitiveness, Lausanne, that prepares the competitiveness report, came to my mind, and he said that Slovenia has very few little problems. And if we fix those, our competitiveness will not be a problem. The problem is that we have the same problems for decades now. So it seems like they're a bug that's just here to stay. So actually, I could talk that, okay, we should give more subsidies, we should give this and that, but I think that the poll that was just shown before actually answers that issue. If we would be able to prepare to make business-friendly environment, and that means low bureaucratic burden, that's more important than low taxes. I mean, just make it easy for business to do the business, and then we'll pay what we have to pay. But make it easy, and then you have the best competitive advantage to bring the foreign investment, but also to keep domestic investments in. So I think that, you know, just making things easy, and you know, we all like to either shop or go somewhere or to a restaurant where we feel nice, and we know that we'll pay something more for that, but it's the ease, it's the how we're accepted there, it's you know, all of that shows some sort of a respect to you as a customer, and investors are customers of a country. So if we treat them as customers, you can pay, you can charge a premium for that. So it's not in the money, everything, it's more in the overall environment. But I would just a little bit go back to the previous round of question. I think that Raj made a very good always look around which sectors will be yoo-hoo and which ones will be the headache for the next few years. I would just add that I think that we'll see a rethink of what is strategic. That it's a new world now, and as Draško was saying, that the supply chain will shorten. A lot of probably production will come closer, as we call that nearshoring. So it's a different. We'll see a different trend than we saw it 10-20 years ago. And it will go as much as on the government level of what is strategic, what is it that we have to have inside the country, what is it that we have to have within our countries that we consider friendly, so to have that sort of protectiveness. And also companies, especially companies that have production, will have to rethink how to manage the risks of the supply chain better. Before it was just in time and the lowest price that you can offer. Now that just in time is not in question anymore, the lowest price has no point anymore, because if you have to say that you'll stop a production of an automotive company and lay 10,000 people off because you're not getting I don't know the English word, whatever, any part. I mean, it's because that part is also used in electronics, which pays more and faster. Then you have a huge question mark and a huge risk. And I think that we'll see a lot of rethinking, and maybe we'll see prices go up, because to lower your risks, that's usually costly. But that is a good thing for the suppliers. So I think it will last a few years until we will reach some sort of a new balance.
Great. Just to give a top on this point, Sonja, it's a great point to make. So Slovenia, Mr. Raj, is more like, let's say, a top supplier of, let's say, of the manufacturing industry of Europe. So this is like, on average, our economy. Of course, we have final products. We're also focused on B2C, but we're mostly very good at B2B. So we put a lot of money into R&D, especially in the manufacturing field. So this is our big strength. So we always welcome investors.
If I would just add that it's very interesting that foreign companies go through a lot of lengthy process of deciding where they will invest. And usually for Slovenia, it's quite challenging to get on the shopping list of the countries, because what you see at the first sight is we don't have a cheap labor force, and we never will have. There is bureaucratic burden. There is not that much subsidies. So why come? And then they come the factors, as you said, well-educated workforce, good productivity, loyal companies. And once they're here, they never leave. And usually the companies that have either, let's say, a production site in Slovenia, or they're a retail chain, they would usually come up in the top 5% of the multinational where they compare to each other. So there is something so specific that when we are in part of a multinational and we do one part of that, we do that among the best in the world. And I think that's also why, let's say, Revos from the Renault is usually one of the best production sites in the Renault-Nissan chain. The same can be said for Danfoss Trata in Slovenia. I mean, the list goes on, and I think that speaks of that we are really good in engineering. Not me personally, but it is one trait of Slovenia, that we are great engineers. We know how to make things every year a little better, and innovate within that. So I think that speaks volume of us. But once once somebody that wants to invest here goes through all of the stuff that makes it difficult to start.
I would just one sentence. I mean, risk calculation, risk management is different and will be different after the crisis.
I would also just like to reinforce what Sonja just said. I've been privileged to be able to go to Singapore almost regularly since the summer of 1987. And that might seem like a counterintuitive model, a city-state, 3 degrees from the equator in the ocean for Slovenia. But I have watched that government and its private sector drive efficiencies that I could have never imagined. From the moment you land in Changi Airport and the speed of customs clearance and immigration clearance, to your hotel, to your work with your businesses, to being able to get a government official on the phone who's accountable and can explain what's going on. In fact, they have reduced customs clearance for merchandise shipments down to less than 30 minutes. So it may be interesting when we ask these questions about Slovenia to look at what Singapore has done and what lessons there might be there in exactly what Sonja has said. How can we be both kind, which of course Singapore is, and also more efficient?
So the Singapore as
point.
benchmark, if I'm correct, Raj. Draško, maybe your final recap. What's your view on the EU level? What will we discuss about in the next 3 months? What's your best view on that?
No, I mean, this one is quite easy. I mean, Bojan, really, the first easy question. No, I mean, actually, I mean, now the budget is under the roof, so to say. It got through the European Parliament and so on. Now, so-called scoping papers, working programs are being prepared for the calls, for the public calls for different programs. So Horizon Europe, you know, Life, Cosme, etc., etc. You know, there are some, of course, I mean, many of those. So now all these programs are being prepared. They will be prepared in next 3 months, according to my info, around April. There's always 1 month or so delay. I mean, knowing from the past. I mean, and then after, when these programs are adopted, then after that, calls follow. Calls for which everyone can actually bid. Of course, some calls are just for EU countries. Some are just for those EU countries participating in certain programs. Some are also for associated countries. Some are for the whole world, like Horizon Europe or ERC grants, you know, this is for basic science and research. You know, so it's different. It's really, as I call it, it's a jungle of instruments, really. It's not so transparent. I really like that. But there are a lot of instruments. So everyone can find some instruments for him or for herself or for itself, if it's company. But of course, also competition is quite tough because everybody's bidding and everybody's there. So this process of evaluating and so on is, again, quite complex. It takes some time. But instruments are there and it's worth trying and doing. And we are, for example, SBRA, our company, is doing that, helping not only Slovenian entities, you know, everyone, you know, helping in obtaining that, what I'm saying.
So the big theme is, let's say, how to provide good projects and how to get the financing of them.
The project has to be within this, you know, priorities of the European Union. And of course, it has to be innovative, you know. You cannot get money for something which is known already.
Maybe just one question from the audience on the administrative burden in Slovenia, where the part of it, of course, stems from the EU legislation. That's true. So the question, just to be familiar with the exact question, does the administrative burden in Slovenia stem also from EU legislation? So my answer is yes, it stems also, but not necessary, because EU legislation is sometimes very vague and offers a candidate country quite some flexibility on what to implement and what not. So basically, in the end, the legislation is a mix of, let's say, guidance from the EU and the implementation on a specific country level. And yes, in Slovenia, we're, let's say, in sense, we're still, let's say, similar to ex-Austro-Hungarian Empire, where the bureaucracy was, let's say, quite strong, quite efficient, sometimes even too much efficient. And of course, our level, let's say, of bureaucracy on, let's say, on in medium-term level, of course, sometimes then creates problems. Maybe not when the legislation is adopted, but more or less this happens when, of course, those projects are taking later time, and then at the end of the day, we'll see that, of course, in the past, some legislation was, let's say, not correctly implemented, and of course offers a problem, especially for the SMEs, to implement those measures. So
I would offer a little bit different answer to that. Actually, I don't think that our administrative burden stems from EU legislation, and we do that on our own. Because Slovenia exports around 75%, you know the figures exactly, to EU. So as long as the companies have the same level where you play, it doesn't actually matter. If we have high costs, so do our competitors. So that doesn't matter. It's what we do with the legislation, and we have sadomaso approach to legislation. And we are so happy when EU legislation comes and we think, how can we make this more strict? How can we make this so unlivable? And
Exactly.
we are so great in that, and of making things really, really difficult. So if we would have just EU legislation, the answer to that poll that we had before wouldn't be that we have to lower the bureaucratic burden, because it would be similar to the rest. And from the standpoint of the Chamber of Commerce, we have never called for get rid of the legislation. We have called for make the legislation comparable to our main partners. Just don't make it more difficult. We are a country that is very export oriented. Our lives depend on how successful we are in exports. And if our state makes it difficult to make this livelihood, it's crazy. It's crazy. And we have this crazy mentality, and that's what we fight for years and decades, and we will never stop as the Chamber of Commerce of Industry, of trying to show that if you're too strict, it doesn't mean that you protect anybody. You make things worse for the society.
And the worst
good
thing.
point. May I just make one sentence? I mean, I know cases when, let's say, certain directive was implemented in European Union, of course, in Brussels, and then some countries would do it very liberal, and in Slovenia this stuck, you know. So the same product would have problems in Slovenia, but not, let's say, in some countries that I wouldn't mention now. But you know, these are true stories, you know.
And the worst thing to mention, you know, guys, is just taking the reverse way is the most difficult. It's very easy to implement new legislation, but going the reverse way, that's a difficult, laborious process and takes time. It takes time because there's a significant level of legislation which has to be changed. For example, number one problem would be, let's say, for our manufacturers, let's say, to get a new plant done on a greenfield level, you know. So this is let's say a typical process where, for example, Slovenia really does not have a competitive edge. Of course, it's easier to have a brownfield investment, let's say, to renovate something, but something building from scratch, that's quite a risky process. And yeah, sure, it does take time. It's involved with costs. And of course, as Slovenia is green, it's beautiful, we're protecting it. And of course, this means also costs for the economy, for the business people, which are, of course, let's say, not used to this kind of restrictive legislation in this field in such a small country, you know. So yeah, this is our, let's say, quite a thing that we would need to address, you know, to get more greenfield investments. So with that having in mind, I would, let's say, close our session. We're 8 minutes after our time, but I think the discussion was really on a high level. I thank you each and everyone for a great discussion. Thank you very much also GEA College for organizing this event, and of course also our audience for posting great questions. I don't think we answered all of them, but I think that we, let's say, try to answer most of them, which of course were probably able to answer when we of course talked about the specific themes. So again, thank you very much everyone, and have a great afternoon and evening.
Thank you so much. Also on behalf of GEA College, we are so delighted to have you all here. So thank you so much, Raj. Thank you so much, Sonja. And thank you so much, Draško. This was really a privilege, and it was an inspiring and interesting debate. Although it was a difficult topic, so to say, economic reforms are not always so interesting to everybody on the first eye, but it was really, really, really well structured, well said, and a lot of new things to learn. So thank you so much. And of course, thanks goes to Bojan also for leading this panel so smoothly. And of course, thank you also, JB, for welcoming us and for joining us here. And of course, for the support of Embassy of United States in Ljubljana. So I hope that all of you participants here, entrepreneurs, and everybody else, you have enjoyed this panel, that you got some interesting feedbacks. I can see from the chat that we have some congratulations, that it was an excellent panel and with interesting and excellent guests, great moderators. So this is all, of course, a privilege to us, and thank you again. And we will see again next week for the webinar for promotion of trade. So So same time, same venue. And of course, I wish you all good evening to the Slovenians, and of course, good day ahead for all Americans here. Thank you again, and hope to see you soon.
Take care. All the best.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
All the best, Raj.
Thank you very much.
It was great getting to know you. You're a very, you have really quite a remarkable view on, I haven't expected such kind of a high level debate, you know.
Oh, well,
I'm really honored.
I hope we get to do many more activities together. I mean, thank you. And I learned a lot from you, and you did such a wonderful job. So let's please do more programs. I would love to.
Great.
Thank you so much, Raj. This is so great to hear. And of course, we are delighted to see that you have enjoyed that, that it was an interesting debate also for you. We really apologize for extending it a little bit over the time, but we would of course love to, that this would be only a starting point, and that we can continue and do more of this stuff, of course, for the young people, for the entrepreneurs, because these are the topics that we need to discuss. So we will be more than eager and privileged to cooperate
For
even
sure.
more. Thank you so much again.
Pleasure, anytime. You bet. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Good evening.
Yes, have a good day. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.